The Alpha King's wild wolf cubs rejected every royal Luna, until they ran straight to the rejected Omega, calling her Mama. Hello everyone, and welcome. Before we begin today's unforgettable story, we have one small favor to ask. Please subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our new videos. It only takes a moment. It is completely free, and your support helps us continue creating heartfelt, emotional stories like this one. We truly appreciate every single one of you. Before we dive into today's journey, let us know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. We always love discovering how far these stories travel and meeting viewers from across the globe. Now let us begin today's story. The ones the world rejects are often the ones a broken heart has been waiting to find. Dawn settled gently over Silverkeep Palace as pale winter sunlight spilled across frost-covered gardens and silent stone towers that had witnessed generations of Alpha rulers. From a distance, the palace looked magnificent, filled with wealth, tradition, and honor, yet behind its towering gates lived a family that no amount of royal power could truly heal. Every noble family dreamed of seeing one of their daughters become the next royal Luna, but every carefully chosen candidate had failed for exactly the same reason. The Alpha King's 3 wolf cubs refused to accept any of them. They ignored expensive gifts, walked away from grand introductions, and never once offered the smallest smile. Rumors spread across the kingdom that the children had become impossible to reach, while whispers quietly blamed the lonely Alpha King for allowing grief to build invisible walls around the hearts of his family. On the same cold morning, a young white Omega named Claire Whitmore arrived at the palace carrying a single worn leather suitcase and a small wooden box filled with carefully wrapped flower seeds she had collected over many years. At 24 years old, she had already learned what rejection felt like. Several powerful pacts had dismissed her without giving her a chance to prove herself, believing her quiet nature would never suit a respected household. Claire no longer expected kindness from strangers. Instead, she focused on offering kindness wherever life carried her. She had not come to Silverkeep hoping to become someone important. The palace steward had hired her for humble work restoring forgotten books inside the old library and bringing life back to a neglected greenhouse that most servants had long since abandoned. When Claire stepped inside the greenhouse for the first time, she paused in complete silence. Dust-covered empty shelves, cracked clay pots rested beneath broken vines, and wilted plants leaned toward the fading winter light as though they had nearly forgotten what spring felt like. Rather than becoming discouraged, Claire smiled softly. She carefully removed her gloves, rolled up her sleeves, opened the wooden box of precious seeds, and whispered, "Everyone deserves another chance to grow." Hour after hour, she swept away dead leaves, polished dusty windows, watered thirsty soil, and gently untangled climbing vines that had been left alone for far too long. Slowly, the forgotten greenhouse began breathing again. The air carried the faint scent of fresh earth instead of neglect, and warm sunlight stretched farther across the stone floor after every clean window reflected the morning sky. Unknown to Claire, 3 curious pairs of young eyes watched everything from behind the greenhouse doorway. The wolf cubs had wandered away from another formal lesson, hoping to escape yet another conversation about future royal Lunas. They expected to find another servant completing unpleasant chores before leaving as quickly as possible. Instead, they discovered a young woman quietly humming while carefully placing tiny seeds into fresh soil as though every single one mattered. None of the children spoke. They simply watched as Claire gently rescued a broken butterfly trapped beneath a fallen branch before setting it free among the winter flowers growing inside the warm glass walls. The youngest cub tilted his head with quiet curiosity. The oldest folded his arms but never looked away. The little girl smiled without realizing it. For reasons none of them could explain, the greenhouse no longer felt lonely. For the first time in many years, it felt like home. The following morning arrived with the quiet promise of new beginnings as gentle sunlight poured through the greenhouse windows, illuminating hundreds of tiny droplets resting upon fresh green leaves. Claire Whitmore was already at work long before the palace stirred awake. She carefully rearranged shelves filled with newly restored books, replaced cracked flower pots with simple clay containers, and softly hummed an old lullaby her grandmother had once sung while tending a family garden. Every movement reflected patience rather than obligation, as though she believed even the smallest task deserved genuine care. Hidden behind the greenhouse doorway, the three wolf cubs returned without making a sound. They had intended to watch only for a few minutes before running off to escape another morning of formal etiquette lessons, yet they found themselves lingering once again. The youngest cub quietly whispered, "She came back." His older brother simply nodded, unable to explain why he had worried she might leave after only one day like so many others before her. Claire never noticed their curious eyes. She became completely absorbed helping a tiny robin that had wandered inside through an open window. Instead of frightening the nervous little bird, she patiently opened both greenhouse doors, stepped back, and waited in complete silence until it gathered enough courage to fly free into the bright winter sky. The little girl watching from behind the doorway smiled so naturally that she forgot she had promised herself never to smile around strangers again. Curiosity slowly overcame caution. The youngest cub took one careful step inside the greenhouse, followed by his sister, while the oldest remained close enough to protect them if necessary. Hearing gentle footsteps behind her, Claire slowly turned and found three children standing quietly among the flowers. Rather than asking who they were or why they had entered, she greeted them with the same warm smile she offered every living thing inside the greenhouse. "Good morning," she said softly. "Would you like to help me wake the flowers?" The unusual question immediately captured their attention. Nobody had ever invited them to help flowers wake up. The youngest tilted his head with fascination. "Can flowers sleep?" he asked. Claire knelt beside a row of delicate winter blossoms and gently brushed away a few dry leaves. Sometimes they only need someone to believe spring is coming. Without another word, the little boy hurried over and carefully copied her movements. His sister soon joined him, watering tiny seedlings with surprising concentration, while the oldest quietly inspected the seed packets neatly arranged upon the work table. He expected Claire to tell him not to touch anything. Instead, she handed him a pair of gardening gloves. "These are the strongest roots," she explained. "Would you help me plant them?" No one had trusted him with something important in a very long time. Hours passed almost unnoticed. Laughter slowly replaced silence as dirt covered small hands and tiny green sprouts found new homes in fresh soil. When the youngest accidentally stumbled over a watering bucket, he landed harmlessly upon the soft earth with a surprised gasp. Claire immediately knelt beside him, gently brushing the dirt from his sleeves before asking with genuine concern, "Are you all right?" The little boy looked into her kind eyes, wrapped both arms around her neck without thinking, and whispered a single word that stopped time inside the greenhouse. "Mama." His brother and sister stared in complete surprise for only a heartbeat before moving beside him. As though the word had been waiting inside their hearts for years, they quietly echoed it together. "Mama." Claire froze, overwhelmed by emotions she had never expected to feel, while outside the greenhouse entrance another silent witness stood motionless. Nathaniel Blackwood had arrived only moments earlier searching for his missing children, but instead he found all three embracing the rejected Omega with peaceful smiles he had not seen since they had lost the warmth of a mother's love. Silence often reveals the truth long before words ever can. Nathaniel Blackwood remained standing just outside the greenhouse doorway, unable to move as he watched the impossible scene unfolding before him. His three wolf cubs still clung to Claire Whitmore with complete trust, their small faces glowing with a peace he had searched for through countless seasons. Every Royal Luna candidate had arrived carrying polished manners, expensive gifts, and carefully rehearsed smiles, yet none of them had earned so much as a friendly glance from his children. This quiet Omega had done it without trying. Claire slowly looked toward the Alpha King, her expression immediately filled with uncertainty. She gently loosened the children's embrace and lowered her eyes with respectful humility. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "I am sorry if I have overstepped my place." Nathaniel studied her for several long moments before speaking. His calm voice revealed little of the storm of questions growing inside him. "Did you encourage them to call you that?" Claire looked genuinely surprised. She slowly shook her head. "No, Your Majesty. I would never ask children to replace someone they love. They chose that word themselves." Before Nathaniel could respond, the oldest wolf cub stepped forward, his young face unusually serious. "She never asked us," he said firmly. "We wanted to call her Mama because she makes this place feel warm again." The little girl quietly nodded. "She listens when we talk," the youngest added with innocent honesty. "She smiles even when nobody is watching." Those simple answers left no room for doubt. Nathaniel looked around the greenhouse with fresh eyes. The dusty shelves had become bright with neatly arranged books. Fresh flowers bloomed where dead vines had once covered broken windows. Sunlight filled every corner after years of neglect, and laughter still lingered in the air as naturally as birdsong. None of it appeared staged. Nothing suggested someone trying to impress a king. Claire had simply cared for everything placed before her, because that was who she was. Over the following days, Nathaniel found himself returning to the greenhouse more often than duty required. Sometimes he stood outside unnoticed while reviewing reports from the kingdom. Other times he quietly observed. Through the glass, as Claire patiently taught the wolf cubs how to plant seeds, repair old books, and care for injured butterflies that drifted inside the warm garden. She never treated them like future rulers. She treated them like children whose hearts deserved patience. One snowy afternoon, the youngest cub proudly presented Claire with a tiny, smooth white stone he had discovered beside the frozen garden path. "It is lucky," he declared. "I want you to keep it." Claire accepted the little gift as though it were the greatest treasure in the kingdom. "Then I will protect it carefully," she replied with sincere gratitude before placing it inside the pocket over her heart. Watching from across the greenhouse, Nathaniel realized something he had never considered before. The value of a gift had never depended upon its price. It depended entirely upon the love with which it was given and received. That evening, while the palace prepared another formal dinner with visiting noble families hoping to present future royal Luna candidates, the wolf cubs quietly refused to attend. Instead, they remained in the greenhouse helping Claire cover delicate flowers before the cold night arrived. As Nathaniel watched his children laughing beneath the warm lantern light, he understood that for the first time since sorrow had entered their lives, they were no longer merely surviving each day. They were beginning to live again, and the woman responsible had never once asked for recognition, only the chance to quietly care for broken things until they bloomed once more. As the days quietly unfolded into weeks, something extraordinary began to happen inside Silverkeep Palace, although very few people understood why. The greenhouse, once forgotten behind dusty glass and fading memories, became the brightest place in the entire castle. Fresh blossoms stretched toward the morning sunlight. Climbing vines wrapped themselves around restored wooden trellises, and the sweet fragrance of lavender and jasmine drifted through open windows into hallways that had long felt cold despite their grand beauty. Every morning before breakfast, the three wolf cubs hurried to find Claire Whitmore instead of avoiding their daily routines. They helped carry watering cans that were almost too heavy for their small hands, counted new flower buds with excited voices, and proudly showed her every tiny leaf that appeared from the seeds they had planted together. Claire celebrated each small success as though it were the greatest achievement in the world, teaching them that growth was never measured by speed but by patience. The lessons did not end inside the greenhouse. During quiet afternoons in the old library, she carefully repaired worn storybooks while the children gathered around a large wooden table. Rather than reading only tales of brave alpha warriors and glorious victories, Claire chose stories about compassion, forgiveness, honesty, and ordinary people whose quiet kindness changed countless lives. After every story, she never told the children what they should learn. Instead, she simply asked gentle questions. "How do you think that person felt?" Or "What would you have done?" Slowly, the children began discovering their own answers, and Nathaniel Blackwood noticed the difference almost immediately. Arguments between the siblings became less frequent. The youngest no longer cried whenever he struggled with a difficult task because Claire reminded him that every flower bloomed in its own season. The little girl began leaving fresh blossoms outside the rooms of lonely servants without telling anyone who had placed them there. Even the oldest cub, who had spent years hiding his feelings behind quiet determination, started helping younger pages carry heavy books through the palace corridors. None of these changes had been requested. They simply grew from the example Claire lived every single day. Nathaniel often found himself standing silently outside the library after completing meetings with his advisors. Through the partially opened door, He watched laughter replace the silence that had once filled every corner of his home. He could not remember the last time his children had looked so peaceful. One afternoon, as golden sunlight poured through the greenhouse ceiling, the youngest cub carefully held up a tiny green sprout that had finally broken through the soil. "Look," he shouted with pure excitement. "It listened to you." Claire smiled warmly and gently shook her head. "No," she answered. "It listened to hope. Hope is what tells living things to keep growing even after a long winter." Nathaniel heard those words from only a few steps away, and they remained with him long after the conversation had ended. Yet while joy quietly returned to the royal family, not everyone welcomed the change. Servants began whispering that the wolf cubs spent more time with a rejected Omega than with visiting noble ladies. Several influential families noticed that invitations to introduce new royal Luna candidates were being politely declined more often than before. In elegant drawing rooms filled with polished silver and expensive tea, quiet conversations slowly transformed into suspicion. Some claimed Claire was manipulating the children. Others insisted no ordinary Omega should ever become so important inside the palace. None of them had spoken to Claire. None of them had seen her humble heart. But envy has always found fertile ground wherever kindness begins to bloom, and beyond the warmth of the greenhouse, unseen shadows were already beginning to gather. The first signs of trouble did not arrive with angry voices or public accusations. They arrived as whispers spoken behind elegant fans, exchanged over polished tables where smiles hid ambition. Noble families who had spent years preparing their daughters to become the next royal Luna began asking the same uncomfortable question. Why were the royal children suddenly refusing every formal introduction while choosing to spend every free moment with an unknown rejected Omega? The rumors grew a little stronger with each passing day. Some claimed Claire Whitmore had somehow charmed the wolf cubs. Others insisted she was quietly positioning herself to gain favor with the Alpha King. None of those stories carried even a trace of truth, yet rumors have never depended upon truth to spread. Claire remained completely unaware of the conversations taking place beyond the greenhouse walls. She continued repairing damaged books, planting spring flowers, and teaching the children that kindness was something people practiced when nobody was watching. One quiet afternoon, she noticed the oldest cub lingering by the library window with unusual silence. "Is something troubling you?" she asked gently. He hesitated before speaking. "Some servants stopped talking when I walked into the hallway. They looked at you before they looked away." Claire offered him a peaceful smile that carried no resentment. "Sometimes people fear what they do not understand," she replied. "The best answer is not anger. The best answer is to keep living with honesty." Although her words comforted the young Alpha, they remained in her own thoughts long after the conversation ended. Over the next several days, small changes became impossible to ignore. Invitations for Claire to assist with palace projects quietly disappeared. Conversations ended whenever she entered a room. A few servants who had once greeted her warmly now avoided meeting her eyes, not because they disliked her, but because they feared becoming targets themselves. Claire understood exactly what was happening. She had experienced rejection before. What saddened her was not the treatment she received, but the possibility that the children might be drawn into conflicts they had never created. That evening, after the wolf cubs had returned to their rooms, Claire sat alone inside the greenhouse beneath the soft glow of hanging lanterns. She looked at the tiny white stone the youngest cub had given her and gently held it between both hands. Every flower around her had begun to bloom because someone had believed they deserved another chance. She wondered if loving this family might now cause them greater pain than her absence ever could. The following morning, Nathaniel Blackwood was summoned to an urgent council meeting. Several influential nobles respectfully but firmly questioned why an unknown Omega had become so closely connected to the royal heirs. They spoke of tradition, appearances, and political stability, carefully disguising jealousy as concern for the kingdom. Nathaniel listened without interruption, but every argument felt strangely hollow compared to the genuine laughter he had witnessed inside the greenhouse. Before the meeting ended, one elder quietly warned, "Your Majesty, affection can cloud even the wisest judgment." Nathaniel offered no immediate answer, yet the words followed him through the palace corridors. At nearly the same moment, Claire quietly packed the same worn leather suitcase she had carried into Silverkeep only weeks before. She folded her simple clothes with steady hands, placed the precious white stone inside the small wooden box of flower seeds, and carefully left behind 3 freshly repaired storybooks, each containing a handwritten note of encouragement tucked inside the front cover. No anger filled her heart. No bitterness clouded her thoughts. She simply believed that true love sometimes required the courage to step away before becoming the reason those you cherished were forced to suffer. When morning finally arrived, the greenhouse greeted the sunrise in complete silence. The watering cans remained neatly arranged where they had been left the evening before. The tiny gardening gloves still rested upon the wooden bench. Fresh blossoms reached toward the light exactly as Claire Whitmore had taught them, but the gentle voice that had filled every corner with warmth was gone. The 3 wolf cubs raced through the palace after breakfast, laughing as they hurried toward their favorite place, expecting to find Claire already tending the flowers. Instead, they found only an empty room and a folded note resting beside 3 carefully repaired storybooks. The youngest looked around in confusion before calling softly, "Mama?" Only silence answered him. The little girl slowly opened the first book and discovered a handwritten message inside. It read, "Never stop believing that kindness is stronger than fear." The oldest opened his book next. "Real courage is choosing compassion when the world expects anger." The youngest hugged his book tightly as tears quietly gathered in his eyes. Inside his was a single sentence. "No matter where life takes us, flowers always remember the hands that cared for them." None of the children spoke as they searched every corner of the greenhouse, hoping Claire might somehow appear from behind the climbing roses. Nathaniel Blackwood arrived moments later after hearing the servants report that Claire's room had been emptied before sunrise. He immediately walked through the greenhouse, noticing every detail she had quietly left behind. The shelves were perfectly organized. Every plant had been labeled with handwritten care instructions. Seedlings had been grouped according to the amount of sunlight they would need in the coming weeks. She had prepared everything for those who remained, asking for nothing in return. Nathaniel picked up the small notebook lying beside the flower beds. It contained schedules for watering, notes about each child's favorite plants, and reminders written entirely for the wolf cubs. The blue flowers bloom more beautifully when someone sings to them. The herbs grow stronger when harvested gently. Do not forget that even on cloudy days, the sun is still there. He slowly closed the notebook, realizing that every page reflected the same quiet heart his children had come to love. Throughout the palace, the change became impossible to ignore. The laughter that had recently filled the corridors disappeared almost overnight. The youngest cub refused to visit the greenhouse without Claire. The little girl stopped leaving flowers outside servants' doors because she no longer smiled while gathering them. Even the oldest returned to his old habit of silently carrying every burden alone. During dinner that evening, 3 untouched plates remained on the table long after the meal had ended. Nathaniel looked around the grand dining hall and understood with painful clarity that the palace itself had not changed. The furniture remained elegant. The chandeliers still glowed. The royal banners still hung proudly above the walls. Yet everything felt strangely empty because the heart that had quietly brought life back into every room was no longer there. As darkness settled beyond the palace windows, Nathaniel walked alone through the greenhouse beneath the soft lantern light Claire had once lit each evening. He noticed one final envelope resting beneath the tiny white stone the youngest cub had given her. She had returned the precious gift. Inside the envelope was a short letter written in graceful handwriting. "Your Majesty, thank you for allowing me to care for a family that taught me hope again. Please do not let my presence become the reason your children carry burdens they never chose. They deserve peace more than they need me. If they continue watering the flowers together, they will discover that love never truly leaves the places where it once grew." Nathaniel read the letter twice before quietly lowering his head. For the first time, he no longer questioned why his children had called Claire Mama. The question that now filled his heart was far more difficult to answer. Why had he allowed the one person who had healed his family to believe she had to walk away alone? The next morning, Nathaniel Blackwood set aside every ceremonial duty that could wait. For the first time in many years, the Alpha King chose not to begin his day with council reports or diplomatic meetings. Instead, he began asking questions that should have been asked long before Claire Whitmore had quietly disappeared. He summoned the palace steward, the head librarian, the greenhouse keeper who had retired years earlier, and every servant who had worked alongside the young Omega. None of them described an ambitious woman searching for power. They described someone who arrived before sunrise, stayed long after sunset, repaired damaged books without being asked, shared warm bread with tired kitchen workers, and quietly left fresh flowers outside the rooms of servants who had fallen ill. One elderly housekeeper wiped away tears as she spoke. She remembered every person's name after meeting them only once. When my hands became too stiff to carry laundry, she finished my work before I even realized she had started. Nathaniel listened in silence, feeling each simple story weigh more heavily than the polished speeches he had heard from countless nobles. Determined to learn the whole truth, he ordered his most trusted royal guard to investigate Claire's life before she had arrived at Silverkeep Palace. Days later, the reports returned, and none of them contained scandal or hidden ambition. Instead, they revealed a quiet pattern of compassion that stretched back for years. In a small riverside village, Claire had spent her free evenings teaching orphan children to read using worn books she repaired herself. During harsh winters, she had delivered baskets of vegetables to elderly widows without leaving her name behind. After a severe summer drought, she had helped restore a neglected community garden so struggling families could harvest fresh food again. Every witness described the same gentle woman, and every act of kindness had been offered without expecting recognition. Nathaniel slowly closed the final report and stared out the palace window toward the greenhouse. The truth became impossible to deny. His children had not been drawn to Claire because she possessed unusual charm or hidden influence. They had simply recognized what adults had overlooked. A heart that genuinely loved others never needed to announce itself. That evening, Nathaniel carried the reports into the greenhouse where the 3 wolf cubs quietly watered the flowers exactly as Claire had taught them. The youngest carefully poured water around a tiny seedling before looking up with hopeful eyes. "Did you find Mama?" Nathaniel knelt beside him instead of answering immediately. "I found something important," he said gently. "I found proof that every kind thing she ever told you was something she had already lived." The oldest cub lowered his eyes. "We already knew that." His quiet answer settled deeply into Nathaniel's heart. Children had seen the truth while the adults had debated appearances. The little girl carefully picked a single white blossom that had opened that morning and placed it into her father's hand. "Flowers grow where people take care of them," she whispered. "Families do too." Nathaniel looked at the delicate flower resting in his palm and finally understood the lesson that had been growing around him from the very beginning. A kingdom could be protected by strength, but a family could only be restored through love, humility, and the courage to admit when pride had blinded the heart. As the evening sun painted the greenhouse with warm golden light, Nathaniel made a decision that surprised even himself. He would no longer wait for Claire to return if fate happened to bring her back. He would leave the palace, search every village within his kingdom if necessary, and personally tell the woman who had quietly healed his children that this time she would not have to carry her burdens alone. The journey away from Silverkeep Palace began before sunrise beneath a sky painted with soft shades of blue and gold. Nathaniel Blackwood rode at the front with the 3 wolf cubs beside him, leaving behind the royal procession that his advisors had insisted upon. There were no banners flying above their carriage, no rows of armored guards announcing the Alpha King's arrival, and no royal fanfare echoing through the countryside. Nathaniel wanted this journey to be about one family searching for another, not a king demanding an audience. Guided by the reports he had carefully read, they traveled through peaceful farming villages, winding forest roads, and quiet streams that reflected the early spring sunlight. Along the way, Nathaniel noticed something remarkable. Nearly every village they passed held a small story about Claire Whitmore. An elderly baker smiled warmly when he heard her name and recalled how she had spent an entire afternoon helping his grandchildren plant herbs outside the bakery. A schoolteacher proudly showed them a shelf of repaired books that Claire had restored one page at a time after heavy rains had damaged them. A young mother pointed toward a flourishing vegetable garden and explained that Claire had organized neighbors to rebuild it after a difficult season so every family would have fresh food to share. Nathaniel listened to every story in thoughtful silence. None of those people knew they were speaking to the Alpha King. Their gratitude was genuine, offered without expectation, and every memory painted the same picture of a woman whose greatest strength had always been quiet kindness. Late that afternoon, they reached a peaceful village surrounded by rolling green hills and blooming wildflowers. Near the edge of the village stood a modest cottage with a small garden overflowing with colorful blossoms. Claire knelt beside a row of young seedlings, gently pressing fresh soil around delicate stems, while several village children happily copied her movements. She laughed softly as one little girl proudly held up a tiny sunflower sprout, celebrating the moment as though it were the greatest treasure in the world. The youngest wolf cub could not contain himself another second. He leaped from the carriage and ran across the garden with all the determination his little legs could carry. "Mama," he called with joyful excitement. Claire slowly looked up, her eyes widening in complete surprise before filling with tears she had tried so hard to hide. Moments later, the other two children reached her, wrapping their arms around her with the same unconditional love they had carried every single day since she had left the palace. Claire embraced all three of them, holding them close as though no distance had ever separated them. Nathaniel approached slowly, stopping several feet away. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers between them as birds sang from nearby trees. Finally, Nathaniel lowered his head with sincere humility. "Claire," he said quietly, "I came here today not as your king, but as a father who failed to protect the person who brought his family back to life. I allowed fear, tradition, and the opinions of others to speak louder than the truth I witnessed with my own eyes. I am deeply sorry." Claire looked at him with calm compassion rather than resentment. Before she could answer, the little girl gently slipped her hand into Claire's and then reached for Nathaniel's other hand, joining them together with the innocent wisdom only a child could possess. "Flowers grow better together," she whispered with a hopeful smile. "Families do too." In that quiet village garden, surrounded by simple beauty instead of royal splendor, Nathaniel realized that the longest journey he had made was never the distance from the palace. It was the distance from pride to humility, and at last, he had found the courage to cross it. Several weeks later, Silverkeep Palace welcomed the arrival of spring in a way no celebration, royal decree, or grand ceremony ever could. Claire Whitmore returned through the palace gates beside Nathaniel Blackwood, not because she had accepted a title or sought recognition, but because she believed every child deserved a home where love could flourish without fear. The three wolf cubs never left her side as they walked together through the familiar corridors. Servants who had once quietly looked away now greeted her with sincere smiles, having witnessed the emptiness that had settled over the palace after her departure. Even those who had doubted her could no longer deny the simple truth standing before them. Peace had returned with the woman who had never asked for power. Days later, the royal court gathered inside the great hall, expecting another formal announcement regarding the search for a royal Luna. Noble families arrived wearing magnificent gowns and finely tailored suits, believing tradition would once again determine the future of the kingdom. Instead, Nathaniel rose from the throne, walked down the marble steps, and stopped beside Claire. He did not speak as a ruler protecting ancient customs. He spoke as a father whose heart had finally learned what truly mattered. "For many years," he said calmly, "I believed a crown chose the person worthy of becoming royal Luna. I was wrong. A crown can recognize honor, but it cannot create it. My children taught me that love cannot be commanded, purchased, or inherited. It is earned through kindness, patience, and quiet sacrifice." Claire Whitmore has already lived those values every single day without asking for reward. Today, I do not honor her because she healed my family. I honor her because she reminded this kingdom what true strength looks like. Silence filled the hall before the three wolf cubs stepped forward together. Without hesitation, they each took one of Claire's hands and smiled with complete certainty. No speech could have spoken more clearly than that simple gesture. One by one, members of the court lowered their heads, not before a future queen alone, but before a woman whose character had earned the respect that status alone never could. In the months that followed, Silverkeep changed in ways few had imagined possible. Claire transformed the forgotten greenhouse into a place where orphaned children, young apprentices, and palace families learned to grow flowers, vegetables, and hope together. The old library became a welcoming center for learning, filled with restored books and comfortable reading corners where every child was encouraged to dream beyond the limits others placed upon them. Nathaniel encouraged leaders throughout the kingdom to judge people by their actions instead of their lineage, and slowly the culture of the realm began to reflect the compassion that had first taken root inside one neglected greenhouse. On a warm afternoon nearly a year later, the 3 wolf cubs gathered in the garden carrying 3 young, evergreen saplings. Together they planted them beside the greenhouse Claire had lovingly restored on her first day at the palace. The oldest smiled as he pressed fresh soil around the first tree. "This one is for love." The little girl gently watered the second. "This one is for hope." The youngest carefully patted the earth around the third before looking up at Claire with the same joyful eyes that had once called her mama for the very first time. "And this one is for home," he whispered. Claire wrapped her arms around the children while Nathaniel stood beside them beneath the gentle spring sunlight. Looking at the growing trees, he understood that kingdoms rise through power, but families endure through compassion. The strongest hearts are never the loudest. They are the ones that quietly choose kindness again and again until that kindness becomes a legacy that continues to grow long after the first seed is planted.